Hank Mallory didn't go looking for trouble. He just wanted a quiet evening after a long cattle run. But when he found a bruised, silent woman asleep in his hayloft, his life took a turn he never saw coming. Her name's Rosie. She don't say much, but there's pain in her eyes, and a secret buried deep in the soil of her family's forgotten land. The next morning, a land agent named Vernon Clagg shows up with papers and a smug grin, claiming Rosie's family property for himself. Says it's unclaimed territory. But Hank sees through the shine. When fences go up overnight and trails get blocked, he knows what's coming. A land grab masked in legal ink and fast talk. As Rosie clings to the fading memory of her father's last words, about something hidden beneath an old wellstone, Hank starts digging for more than just truth. What begins with a bruised girl in a hayloft soon turns into a fight for justice, heritage, and a piece of land no lawman or land shark has the right to take. Will one quiet cowboy be enough to stand against power, lies, and a town too scared to speak? Or will Rosie's story vanish like dust in the wind? Subscribe if you believe some land and some people are worth fighting for. Hank Mallory returned to the ranch just after dusk, boots coated in dust, hat rims stained with trail sweat. The cattle run to cross timbers had taken 3 days longer than expected thanks to a busted axle and 2 wandering steers. All he wanted now was coffee strong enough to scald the tongue and a quiet night in his own bed. But when he stepped into the barn to hang his saddle, something shifted overhead. At first, he figured it was a raccoon or barn owl. The hayloft had its share of visitors, some furry, some feathered. But this was different. The rustle was too heavy, too human. He climbed the ladder slow, hand on the hilt of the knife tucked behind his belt. Moonlight pooled through the cracks in the roof boards, softening the edges of everything, except her. She was curled against the far wall like a fawn hiding from a storm. Young, maybe early 20s, barefoot, hair tangled, face bruised along the jawline. A worn shawl covered her shoulders, and one hand clutched the handle of a canvas satchel like it was the only thing tethering her to the world. When she saw him, she flinched, but she didn't scream. "You hungry?" Hank asked gently, voice low like speaking to a skittish mare. She blinked, lips chapped. After a moment, she gave the smallest nod. He tossed her a canteen first, then climbed back down, fixed a plate of biscuits and beans, and brought it back without a word. He didn't ask who she was or why she was there. Not that night. Just made sure she ate and had a blanket. By morning, she was still there. "I go by Hank," he said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "This place is called Mallory Ranch. Runs from the ridge yonder down to Cold Creek." She sat on the edge of the loft, legs tucked beneath her, sipping slow. "My name's Rosie," she said finally, voice like dried wind through cotton. "You got folks nearby?" She shook her head. "Used to. Not anymore." He didn't press, just handed her a boiled egg and sat across from her in the hay. By midday, word spread fast, same as it always did in towns like Calico Ridge. Vernon Clagg, the land agent out of Temple County, had posted a fresh claim notice at the edge of the old Bright Creek property, the one that used to belong to the Bell family before the place was abandoned after the fever took half the town. Hank rode out to see for himself. Sure enough, a bright yellow sign had been nailed to the split-rail gate. Reclamation notice, Parcel 14B, subject to reassignment under Territorial Act 1890. Clagg's signature was as sharp and proud as ever. Hank spat into the dust. He remembered Rosie had said her name plain, but not her last name. That evening, she stood near the barn fence watching the sun drop behind the hills. "That land up past Bright Creek," Hank said gently. "Any reason it matters to you?" She hesitated, fingers tightening on the rail. "It was my family's. My daddy. He said he hid something under the old wellstone. Said if ever we had to leave, we'd come back for it." Hank studied her. "That well's fenced off now, part of Clagg's survey lines." Her eyes didn't move from the horizon. "Figures. You want me to check?" She looked up at him then, full and fierce for the first time. "You'd do that?" Hank nodded. "Ain't right, what they're trying. Folks like Clagg think no one'll remember who lived there. But this land, it remembers." Rosie's shoulders eased, just slightly. That night, after she'd gone to rest, Hank stood by the barn and looked out toward Bright Creek. The stars above were clear and sharp, same as always. But something in the air had shifted, like the soil itself was holding its breath. Because whatever Rosie's father left behind under that well stone, someone didn't want it found, and Hank Mallory had just stepped into the middle of it. By the time Hank rode out to check the trailhead that fed into Bright Creek, the barbed wire was already up, tight, gleaming, and fresh. It wasn't a simple property marker either. This fence was deliberate, a straight run that cut across the old cattle trail like a knife, the trail Hank had used for the better part of 15 years to move his herd through spring graze. 3 men on horseback sat nearby under the cottonwoods watching. Hired muscle. Their hats were clean, shirts tucked, rifles in reach, but not drawn. Yet. "Y'all got business stringing this?" Hank called out, reining his horse up just shy of the line. One of them, broad-shouldered and slick-shaved, tipped his hat. "Per orders of Vernon Clegg, this land's under reassignment. Ain't yours to cross." "It's been public access trail since before Clegg got his boots dusty," Hank replied coolly. Another rider pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Cease and desist notice. Addressed to Hank Mallory. You've been warned." Hank took the paper but didn't read it. "You boys always pass out threats on Sundays, or is this a special favor?" The broad one smirked. "Ain't a threat, mister. Just the way things work now." Hank turned his horse without another word, but the back of his neck burned all the way home. When he got to the barn, Rosie was sitting with her knees drawn up, coat pulled around her like armor. She looked up, sharp-eyed. "They fenced it, didn't they?" He nodded, jaw tight. Rosie stood, pacing. "It's more than just land to them. Clegg, he always talked fast, but my daddy said the man knew every loophole there was. Said Clegg was the kind who'd sell you the sun if you were dumb enough to sign." "You ever see a deed?" Hank asked. "Anything left from your family?" She hesitated. "Mama kept a box, locked it up under the porch, but when the fever hit, we left with what we could carry. By the time I came back, everything was burned. Roof, shed. Even the well stone looked blackened like someone tried to bury something there." That caught Hank's attention. "Still blackened now?" She nodded. "But I never dug. Was too scared someone might see me." That night, while Rosie slept in the loft, Hank packed a spade and a lantern, then rode out under cover of dark. He tied off his horse in the scrub brush and walked the last half-mile. The Bright Creek homestead was a ghost. Sagging chimney, half-rotted gate, wild brush swallowing the edges. But the well stone sat intact, round and thick, just where Rosie said. Hank knelt beside it, scraping back dirt and ash from the edges. It wasn't buried deep, just layered with years of dust and weeds. But something caught his eye at the base of the stone, a charred slip of parchment lodged in the crack where the mortar had split. He eased it out gently, careful not to tear what little was left. Most of the words were scorched away, but the date remained. Filed, June 3rd, 1879. And at the very bottom, half faded, a seal stamped into the corner. Bell Family Holdings. Hank exhaled slow, the weight of it pressing down like thunderclouds. Someone had tried to burn the past, erase the paper trail, but they hadn't finished the job. As he rode back through the darkness, he tucked the fragment deep into his saddlebag. It wasn't enough for a claim, not yet, but it was something. When he reached the barn, Rosie was waiting, blanket draped over her shoulders. "You went back," she said. He nodded. Found a piece of the deed, burned but dated. Her eyes filled, but she held it back. "That means something, don't it?" Hank looked at her, worn, bruised, but unbroken. "It means we're not done," he said softly, "and Clegg ain't seen the last of either of us." The morning sun rose soft and pink over Calico Ridge, but the tension that hung in the air made it feel colder than it was. Hank leaned on the porch rail, sipping his second cup of coffee, the charred fragment of the deed laid flat on the table beside him under a smooth stone. Rosie sat nearby, staring off toward the Bright Creek line. "There's got to be more," she said, voice low. "That piece you found, it's proof someone tried to destroy it. But maybe the original wasn't the only copy. Hank rubbed the stubble on his chin. Most land filings before '80 had a cornerstone, physical markers. Gus would know. Rosie turned toward him. Gus? Old Gus Tiller. Used to be the county surveyor. Retired now. Keeps a shack out by Split Timber Hill. Bit of a hermit, but his memory's sharp as a branding iron. Within the hour, Hank was saddling his horse. You're not going alone, Rosie said, stepping up beside him. You sure you're up for that ride? I've been run off, fenced out, and nearly forgotten, she said, eyes steady. I think I can handle a bumpy trail. Split Timber was a 4-mile ride, mostly uphill. By the time they reached the weathered shack at the edge of a dry bluff, Rosie's face was flushed and her hands dusted from the reins. But Gus was out front already, peeling an apple with a pocket knife, eyes squinting under a drooped hat brim. Well, I'll be, Gus muttered, spitting, the peel. A Mallory and a Bell girl, if I ain't mistaken. Rosie blinked. You know me? Knew your daddy, Gus said. Honest man. Used to share jerky with me at land hearings. He glanced at Hank. What brings you two up this ridge? Hank explained, showing him the charred corner of the deed. Gus frowned, ran a calloused finger over the date. Parcel 14B, Bright Creek East Field. I marked that myself back in '79. You remember placing a cornerstone? Hank asked. Sure do. Square chunk of granite, 4 notches, right along the south fence line, marked the edge of the Bell land. Gus stood slowly, joints creaking. But you ain't gonna find it now. Why not? Rosie asked. 'Cause I rode by there 3 weeks ago and saw Clagg's boys digging, right where that marker used to sit. My guess, they hauled it off and pitched it. Rosie's hands balled into fists. They knew. Course they did. But, Gus added, your daddy was smarter than most. He asked me to place a second marker, hidden. Said in case of trouble he wanted a backup record. Hank leaned in. Where? Gus smiled slow. Inside the foundation rock of the Bright Creek Church, far left corner under the vestibule. Rosie's mouth dropped. The church? Your mama played piano there near every Sunday, Gus said. Would have seemed natural. By the time they reached town, it was near evening. Hank stabled the horses while Rosie went to the church. The preacher was still inside, tidying hymnals. I'm sorry, Rosie said softly. I didn't mean to intrude. He turned and smiled kindly. Rosie Bell, I'd heard you were back. Come to walk the old pews? She hesitated, then nodded. Something like that. He didn't question her further, just handed her a lantern and motioned toward the cellar stairs. Watch your step. Below, the air was damp and cool. Rosie crouched near the front corner, brushing away old cobwebs and grit. Her fingers found the edge of the rock Gus had described, slightly different texture, smoother grain. Her breath caught. Etched faintly in the corner was a sequence of initials and numbers. BB 14B 1879. She whispered, Daddy. Just then, behind an old crate, she spotted something else. An oilskin-wrapped book, dusty but intact. She peeled it open. Inside the front cover was a name, Margaret Bell. And tucked into the back, folded crisp and sealed with red wax, was a notarized copy of the original land deed. Rosie stood still, lantern trembling in her hands. Because finally, after all the silence and shame, the past had spoken, and it was on her side. The town of Calico Ridge prided itself on 2 things, sunrises and Sunday service, and that morning, both arrived hot and full of tension. By the time Hank and Rosie reached the church, the pews were already packed. Children squirmed in their best clothes, old ranchers tipped their hats slow, and wives fanned themselves beneath stained glass light. At the front, Reverend Ellsworth stood tall in his black coat, voice smooth as river stone. But something was different today. Vernon Clagg sat in the second pew, clean-shaven, crisp as if the dirt of land feuds never touched his boots. Next to him, a young assistant in wire-rim glasses held a ledger tight to his chest. Hank and Rosie slid into a back pew. The eyes that turned toward them weren't hostile exactly, but they weren't kind either. Rosie felt them like burrs in her shawl. Reverend Ellsworth cleared his throat near the close of the sermon. Before we part, I'd like to share a blessing from one of our more generous neighbors. Clegg stood, smiled like a fox in Sunday lace. This town deserves a new roof over this fine sanctuary. I'm pledging the funds, today. Consider it a gift, for the good of the county. A few scattered claps, a couple of murmured amens. Hank rose from his seat. With all respect, he said, voice steady but low, maybe what this town needs more than a roof is an honest accounting of the land, of the deeds, of the folks getting fenced off without warning. Murmurs stirred. Clegg didn't even look his way, just smiled and sat back down, as if Hank hadn't spoken at all. Reverend Ellsworth cleared his throat. Let's keep today a day of grace. Rosie's hands were balled in her lap. Later, as the congregation gathered outside for lemonade and pie, the scent of smoke drifted through the air. It was faint at first, then sharp. Someone screamed. From the side of the church kitchen, flames licked up from under the eaves. A kettle must have boiled over on the stove, sparking against the dry timber. Without a second thought, Rosie grabbed a bucket. Hank was already hauling water from the well. In a flurry of motion, half the town joined in. Gus dragged a rug across the porch to smother the base. The preacher tossed his coat into the flames. Together, they beat it back, smoke stinging, eyes watering, hearts thudding. When it was finally out, Rosie collapsed onto the steps, coughing. Reverend Ellsworth knelt beside her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. You saved our kitchen, he said, voice hoarse. Not sure how to thank you. Rosie looked up, soot streaked across her cheeks. There is something. That afternoon, beneath the church with a borrowed lantern, Rosie returned to the cellar. She retraced her steps to the foundation rock and gently pulled the oilskin bundle from its hiding place. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. Upstairs, the preacher waited in the back pew, cradling a cup of tea. She placed the hymn book in his lap. My mother's, she said quietly. Margaret Bell. It's got the deed. Notarized. He opened the back page, eyes scanning slowly. His fingers traced the seal. Well, I'll be. Rosie met his gaze. Can I trust you? Ellsworth looked older in the lamplight, tired but kind. I may have welcomed Clegg's donation today, but I won't sell out the truth. Not for a roof, not for 100. He handed the book back, reverent. Whatever happens next, you don't walk alone, Rosie. Back at Mallory Ranch that evening, Rosie sat at the kitchen table, the hymn book beside her, open like a door to something sacred. Hank leaned in the doorway, watching her. You ready to file? She nodded. Tomorrow. Outside, the stars blinked to life, and the scent of ash still lingered faint in the air, but so did something steadier, like hope. Because in the cellar of an old church, a girl found more than a deed. She found her name again, and it wasn't going to be buried this time. The Calico Ridge County office didn't open until 9, but Hank and Rosie were waiting on the steps by 7:30. The hymn book lay tucked in Rosie's satchel, bound tight with twine. Hank carried a second folder, Gus's signed affidavit verifying the cornerstone placement from 1879. Rosie shifted on the wooden bench, nerves tapping through her boots. Think it'll hold? She asked. It's a legal deed with a witness and a historical survey marker, Hank replied. It'll hold. Just then, the door creaked open. Millie Tabor, the clerk, blinked in surprise. Well now, she said, y'all beat the coffee. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust, ink, and old wood. Millie flipped open her register and read through the documents with the slow precision of someone who knew paper could outlast men. I'll log this under Land Challenge Code 8, she said at last. Once it's filed, Clegg has 10 days to respond. Until then, no new construction or fencing can proceed on Parcel 14B. Rosie let out a long breath. That means he can't touch it? Millie gave a slow smile. Not legally. By noon, the word was out. Hank could feel it in the way people looked at them on the boardwalk. Some tipped hats, others crossed the street, but nobody said much. Clagg's response came that evening, not in words, but in damage. One of Hank's ranch hands, Joe Rears, galloped in from the southern ridge, face pale. "They ran your herd, Hank," he panted. "Cut the wire and spooked 'em hard. A couple dozen stampeded clear to the canyon flats. One steer's dead. Shot, clean through the shoulder." Hank clenched his jaw. "Who?" Joe hesitated. "Didn't see the faces, but they left a calling card." He held up a strip of red fabric, same color as the bandanas Clagg's riders wore last spring. That night, Hank rode out to recover what he could. Rosie insisted on joining, bundled in her coat despite the late chill. It was near midnight when she spotted something in the brush, a calf limping, alone and bleeding from a shoulder nick. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling in the dirt. Hank dismounted, grabbing a feed sack and canteen. Together they cleaned the wound as best they could, binding it tight with Rosie's scarf. "Poor thing got separated in the chaos," she said, brushing its nose. "But it held on." Hank looked at her, brow furrowed. "Like someone else I know." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. They carried the calf home in the wagon bed, bundled in hay. Rosie refused to leave its side, whispering calm as it shook. By dawn, it had stopped trembling. As they tended the little one, a rider trotted up the drive, dusty, official-looking, with a brown satchel slung over one shoulder. "Hank Mallory?" he called out. "That's me. Got a letter here. Legal courier from Prescott." Hank signed and opened it right there. Rosie stood beside him, the calf nuzzling her boot. His eyes scanned the page, then again, slower. "It's from a firm named Harlan and Fitch," he murmured. "They represent the Bell Family Trust." Rosie blinked. "Our trust? I thought it was dissolved after Mama died." "Wasn't," Hank said. "Looks like it went dormant. Funds sat untouched, land still listed under provisional hold." She stared at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning you're not just heir to a claim, you're heir to a protected trust. And this challenge we filed?" He held up the page. "It just got teeth." For a long time, Rosie didn't speak. Then she bent down, picked up the calf, and held it close. "His name's Lucky," she said. Hank grinned. "Why's that?" "Because he made it through," she said, voice firm. "And so will we." Behind them, the morning sun lit up the field in gold. Fences could be mended, trails reclaimed. But some battles, some names, were written deeper than wire or deeds, and they were just getting started. It wasn't even dawn when the knock came, hard and fast, like a storm on the porch. Hank opened the door, still half-dressed, boots in hand. Sheriff Buell stood there with two deputies, eyes downcast, but shoulders stiff. "Hank," Buell said, not quite meeting his gaze, "you need to come with us." "For what?" Hank asked calmly. "Harboring a fugitive squatter. A complaint's been filed. Judge signed a hold order late last night." Rosie appeared behind Hank, still in her robe, clutching Lucky close to her chest. Her mouth fell open. "That's a lie." Buell looked torn. "I don't write the law, Rosie." "No," Hank said sharply, "but you decide how it's used." The sheriff didn't reply, just nodded to his men. They cuffed Hank, not rough but not gently either, and loaded him into the back of the wagon. The sky was still dark, stars barely faded. Rosie watched the wheels disappear down the ridge road, tears streaking her cheeks without sound. The town was already buzzing by the time Hank was locked into the single holding cell behind the county office. Gossip moved fast in Calico Ridge, faster than cattle in spring mud. He sat on the cot, staring at the wall. The steel bars weren't what stung. It was the whispering outside. Folks he'd helped dig fence lines for, neighbors who once borrowed sugar. Now their voices carried like judgment. He must have done something. Clag don't bother nobody unless there's reason. Never thought Hank Mallory'd fall in with squatters. The door opened sometime after noon, and a man stepped in, leaning on a cane. His beard was silver, his face drawn, but his voice still held gravel. "Hank Mallory," he said. "Didn't expect to see you here." Hank stood. "Emmett Barnes?" The man gave a weary nod. "What's left of me?" Emmett had once owned the Cedar Rock Ranch, 3 ridges over. His cattle were legendary. Then 3 years ago, Clegg had laid claim to part of his pasture, arguing a lapsed deed renewal. Within months, Emmett had lost it all: land, livestock, pride. Folks said he left town. Turns out he just disappeared. "Clegg hit you too," Hank said. "Hit me hard," Emmett replied. "Filed forged papers, paid the right ears. By the time I knew what was happening, the judge had already signed it over." Hank leaned closer. "Why come back now?" Emmett tapped his cane. "Because I heard you filed a challenge, and Clegg's getting nervous. That means someone finally hit back hard enough to scare him." He paused, voice softening. "I've still got some papers. Ledger pages from Clegg's office I grabbed before they tossed me out. I kept them hidden. Maybe it's time someone saw them." Just then the door creaked again. Rosie burst in, wind-blown and flushed. She carried a thick envelope in one hand, dust still clinging to her sleeves. "I went to Prescott," she said breathlessly. "Brought back the full trust file, sealed, certified, everything Clegg ignored." Hank's mouth parted. "You rode there and back alone?" She nodded, fierce and proud. Didn't have much choice. Sheriff Buell stood behind her, arms crossed, face unreadable. "She showed me," the sheriff said slowly. "And I made a call. The district clerk confirms it. Rosie Bell is the sole beneficiary of the Bright Creek Trust. That makes her a legal landholder." Rosie held out the envelope. "I also brought this, a copy for the judge." Buell looked at Hank. "You're free to go." As Hank stepped out of the cell, Rosie rushed into his arms, nearly dropping the papers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hank said, voice hoarse, "You didn't have to do all that." She looked up at him. "Yes, I did. You stood for me. Now I stand for what's mine." Emmett chuckled from the corner. "Looks like Clegg picked the wrong ranch to push." Outside, a few townsfolk stared. But this time, the whispers sounded different. Like maybe they were starting to remember who Hank Mallory was, and who Rosie Bell just became. The Calico Ridge Courthouse hadn't seen a crowd like that in years. Farmers, shopkeepers, school teachers, and ranch hands all filled the room. The air buzzed with curiosity, but underneath was something sharper: restlessness. Rumor had spread like mesquite fire. Hank Mallory and Rosie Bell were squaring off with Vernon Clegg in open session. Rosie sat straight-backed beside Hank at the petitioner's table, wearing a borrowed dress and boots still dusted from the trail. Her fingers gripped the envelope from Prescott. Across the aisle, Clegg lounged in a tailored vest, thumbs hooked in his pockets like he already owned the outcome. Judge Halbrick entered, a man known more for punctuality than personality. He banged the gavel once. "Call in docket 312, property dispute regarding parcel 14B, formerly known as Bright Creek." Clegg rose first, all charm and certainty. "Your Honor, this case is built on sentiment and outdated paperwork. Miss Bell's claim, while emotionally compelling, is legally defunct. The land was vacant, unused. Per the 1890 Territorial Reclamation Act, I filed for reassignment. I have the paperwork, properly notarized." He handed over a crisp stack. "Additionally, I have surveyor statements confirming abandonment." The judge flipped through the documents, nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Clegg." Then his gaze turned. "Miss Bell, Mr. Mallory, you may proceed." Rosie stood slowly, every eye in the room on her. "Your Honor, my name is Rosie Bell. My family owned Bright Creek Ranch until the fever of '88. We left fast, but my father left behind the original deed, sealed inside the church foundation. Last week I recovered it. It's notarized. I also bring trust documents from Harlan and Fitch in Prescott confirming I'm the sole heir to the Bell Family Trust. That trust holds primary rights to parcel 14B. She handed them over. The judge studied the wax seal, then the signature. His brow lifted. "Genuine?" "Our clerk verified it this morning," Sheriff Buell spoke up from the back, arms folded. Clegg smirked. "Even so, the land was abandoned for over 3 years. And I have records." Hank rose. "Your Honor, we believe those records were tampered with. Former rancher Emmett Barnes can attest to similar errors made on his deed. And we have Gus Tiller's affidavit, your former county surveyor, stating he placed a cornerstone for the Bell family, later found missing. There's a pattern here." Murmurs rippled through the benches. Judge Halbrick frowned. "Do you have that affidavit?" Rosie handed it over. Then, quietly from the gallery, someone stood. "I got something to say." It was one of Clagg's hired riders, Clem Raleigh. His face was pale, hat clutched in shaking hands. The judge nodded. "Speak, son." Clem cleared his throat. "Last spring, Clegg had me and the boys dig up survey markers. Said they was misaligned, but they weren't. And he paid us to sign off on statements saying the land was unused. It wasn't right." Gasps echoed. Clegg turned, eyes narrowed. "You're finished, Raleigh." "Maybe," Clem muttered. "But I ain't a liar." The judge leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. Then he looked at Clegg. "Mr. Clegg, based on the evidence, sworn statements, and the notarized trust deed, I am suspending all claims filed under your name for Parcel 14B pending a full investigation. Furthermore, the county will initiate a formal review of your prior land acquisitions." Clagg's face went slack. Rosie closed her eyes, just for a second. "Is that all?" Judge Halbrick asked. Hank stepped forward. "One more thing. This fight wasn't just about a pasture or a fence. It's about not letting the truth get buried just because someone's got the money to dig deeper." The judge nodded slowly. "Well said." As court adjourned, townsfolk began to clap, not loud, but steady. It wasn't celebration. It was recognition. Outside, Rosie exhaled like she hadn't in days. "Did we win?" Hank smiled. "We turned the tide." Rosie looked back at the courthouse, then up at the sky. The clouds had finally cleared. But she knew now, the real rebuilding was only just beginning. Vernon Clegg didn't show his face in town the next morning. The courthouse buzzed with whispers and bootsteps as state-appointed auditors arrived from Prescott in a black-wheeled wagon with official seals stamped on the side. 3 of them, all stiff collars and ink-stained fingers, carried ledgers, inkwells, and an order signed by a territorial judge. "Per Directive 47B," one announced at the land office, "we're here to seize and examine all property filings made by Mr. Vernon Clegg within the last 5 years." Millie, the clerk, blinked behind her spectacles. "You'll be wanting the back cabinets." By noon, stacks of files littered every flat surface of the office. Rosie stood beside Hank just outside the window, watching as one of the men scribbled furiously in a leather-bound journal. "You think they'll find something?" she asked quietly. Hank nodded. "They already have." Across the street, Clagg's office door hung ajar. His assistant was nowhere to be seen. The building had the look of something already halfway forgotten. That afternoon, Sheriff Buell made it official. With a copy of the court transcript in one hand and a new badge from the regional marshal's office in the other, he posted a public notice outside the general store. Effective immediately, Vernon Clagg's authority as land agent is suspended. His properties are under review. Pending charges include document forgery, bribery, and fraudulent acquisition. Folks crowded around, reading it twice to be sure. "I'll be," muttered old Mrs. Latimer. He finally slipped. Behind her, Emmett Barnes chuckled. "Told y'all his ledger wasn't clean." Rosie didn't smile. She just stared at the paper, shoulders square. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was justice finally catching its breath. That evening, Hank hitched the wagon and drove her back out to Bright Creek. The fences were still bent in places, and the land bore scars from months of neglect. But it was hers again. Truly, legally, finally. They reached the old barn near dusk. Lucky, now healed and spry, trotted behind them on wobbly legs. "Still looks rough," Hank said, scanning the windswept ridge. "But it's yours to shape." Rosie stepped out, boots crunching the dry grass. "My daddy planted a peach tree over there," she said, pointing near the north side. "Never grew much. Might still be a root down there somewhere. We can dig it up, see if it'll take." She turned to him, eyes soft. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Hank scratched the back of his neck. "Well, you did ride to Prescott alone and take on a courthouse full of strangers." She smirked. "Yeah, but you made me believe I could." The next morning, town was different. A local reporter from Prescott had rolled in, young, eager, full of questions. He interviewed Hank, Rosie, Emmett, and even Gus. The man's eyes lit up when Rosie told him about the hymn book. "This'll make page 2 at least," he said, scribbling. "Maybe front if I pitch it right. Rancher and orphan girl defeat land swindle." "I'm not an orphan," Rosie replied. "I'm just reclaiming my roots." The town council, looking to make amends for its silence, voted unanimously that afternoon to rename the trail leading from Hank's ranch to Bright Creek. It had always been a cow path, dusty and winding, but it carried weight now. Sheriff Buell read the resolution from the porch of the town hall. "Effective this season, the trail between Mallory Ridge and Bright Creek will be known as Rosie's Run." Rosie stood beside Hank in stunned silence. The crowd clapped, not loud, not forced, just honest. Later, as they rode home under a sky blooming with stars, Rosie leaned her head against Hank's shoulder for a moment. "You ever think things would end up this way?" she asked. Hank gave a soft laugh. "Not in 1,000 years." She looked up at him. "Feels like a beginning more than an end." He nodded. "That's exactly what it is." Behind them, the lights of Calico Ridge flickered like lanterns in the dark, still standing, still watching. But now they saw her for who she truly was, and they'd never forget her name again. The first hammer swing echoed across Bright Creek like a heartbeat. Hank stood on the ladder, bracing the signpost with one hand and driving the final nail with the other. Below him, Rosie held the plank steady, squinting against the sun. "Easy now," she said. "That wood took me 2 days to sand." "You mean 2 days to boss me around while I did it?" Hank muttered with a grin. She rolled her eyes. "Keep talking, and I'll make the next one say Hank's Folly." He climbed down and stepped back with her to admire their handiwork. The letters were clean, carved deep and dark into white pine. Bright Creek Ranch, Estranton 1880, reclaimed, 1892. Rosie ran her fingers across the grain, then looked at Hank. "Think they'll read it right?" He nodded. "They'll know someone fought to make it real again." The ranch was still a work in progress, but progress had roots now. The broken fence lines had been patched, the old barn roof no longer sagged, and the creek, finally flowing steady again, sang through the back field with the ease of a thing long held back. Lucky, the calf Rosie had nursed, had grown sturdy and bold. He followed her like a pup, nuzzling her hands, nudging her boots. She swore he understood every word. Rosie spent her days mending, hauling, riding fence lines. It didn't matter that her hands blistered or that her arms ached at night. This land had been her family's, and now it was her future. One morning, she found a stack of lumber by the well and a penciled note in Hank's handwriting. "Thought it was time you had a place of your own, not just a corner in the hayloft. H." She stared at it for a long time, smiling without meaning to. That afternoon, neighbors showed up unasked, Gus with a wheelbarrow of nails, Emmett Barnes with lumber, even Millie from the courthouse with a basket of biscuits and a jug of sweet tea. Hank watched from a distance, letting Rosie give the orders. She stood on the half-framed porch by sundown, dust on her cheeks, hair loose in the breeze, and grinned. "Ain't much yet," she said. "It's enough," Hank replied, meaning more than she probably knew. The next Sunday they rode into town together. Rosie wore her mother's blue shawl, freshly washed, and Hank cleaned up so much that Gus joked he looked like a banker. Folks waved, real waves this time, not the stiff, uncertain ones from weeks ago. Even Sheriff Buell tipped his hat and said, "Morning, Miss Bell." As they hitched their horses by the mercantile, Rosie paused. A hand-painted sign had been nailed to the post nearby. Rosie's Run, Trail to Bright Creek Ranch. Below it, someone had added in smaller letters, "Where names come home again." Rosie blinked hard. Hank noticed but said nothing. Later they sat on the church steps with peach pie in their laps, watching kids race through the grass, the sun warm on their backs. "You ever think," Rosie asked, "you'd end up with a ranch, a calf named Lucky, and a girl with stubborn grit and legal papers?" Hank chuckled. "Not exactly. but I've learned not to argue with fate, or with you." She leaned back, gaze stretching across the town, then the hills beyond. "I used to feel like I didn't belong anywhere," she said quietly. "Like every place I touched already belonged to someone else. But now, you belong here," Hank finished. She looked at him, eyes steady. "So do you." The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of cut hay and creek water. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried, circling over golden fields. Hank reached into his coat and handed her a small piece of wood. She turned it over, etched carefully with her name. "For your new front door," he said. She smiled, cradling it in both hands like it was something sacred. For the first time in a long time, Rosie Bell didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was home. And that made all the difference. If you believe a cowboy's word still means something, saddle up and subscribe for more frontier tales.